When I heard the soft creak of the door opening, I thought it was the cat again. But then I felt it, that subtle shift in the air, the weight of someone's presence in the room. I turned, half-dressed, still fastening the clasp on my bra, and saw him standing there in the doorway. My father-in-law. He froze. And I did too. The silence between us stretched like a taut wire, humming with the kind of tension I wasn't ready to name. His eyes darted away, apologetic, but lingered for a second too long. That second was everything. That second lodged itself inside my skin like a splinter I wouldn't be able to remove. I told myself it was an accident. That he didn't mean to walk in. That I should have locked the door. But something in his expression, something in the way he hesitated before backing out, told me this moment would echo. It wasn't the beginning, not really. The beginning had happened long before that. Maybe the day his wife died. Or the first time he asked me how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. I didn't know then just how much that pause would mean. How it would unravel the neat little threads of my marriage. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the real beginning, the morning I first realized I was married, but completely alone. Before I share the truth I've carried in silence for months, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And have you ever had a moment you wish you could erase, but somehow can't stop revisiting? It was early. The kind of morning where the sky still clings to a pale gray, unsure if it wants to commit to daylight. I reached across the bed instinctively, as I always did, expecting warmth, the heavy presence of a familiar body beside mine. Instead, my hand met the cool sheets. Empty. Again. He had left without waking me. Again. There was a note on the nightstand, meeting in Jakarta. Back late. Coffee's ready. Love you. 4 short sentences. 4 mechanical gestures of care that felt more like a checklist than affection. I stared at it longer than necessary, unsure if I was more hurt by his absence or by how little I reacted to it anymore. I sat up slowly, pressing my fingers into my thighs, trying to anchor myself in the present. The house was quiet. Still. The kind of stillness that made you feel like even your thoughts were too loud. Somewhere downstairs, I could hear the ticking of the clock in the kitchen, the steady hum of the refrigerator. Domestic silence. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, he was already there. My husband's father. Sitting at the breakfast table, reading yesterday's paper. A mug of coffee steamed in front of him. He looked up and gave me a polite nod. Morning. I nodded back, pulling my cardigan tighter around me, though the morning wasn't particularly cold. Morning. He had moved in 6 months ago. After she passed. The grief had flattened him in the beginning, that kind of hollow, vacant grief that made you wonder if they'd ever come back to themselves. But lately, he seemed steadier. Quieter, but present. Helpful around the house in small, unnoticed ways. We went about our routines in parallel. I made toast. He flipped a page. We barely spoke. But when I reached up to grab the honey from the top shelf, my sweater lifted slightly, revealing a sliver of my lower back. I caught the flicker of his gaze from the corner of my eye. Quick, but unmistakable. I froze for just a second. Then, deliberately, I tugged the sweater down and turned away. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I wanted to imagine it. I wasn't sure which was worse. Later that morning, I found myself standing in the guest room closet. Not looking for anything in particular. Just standing. My hand brushed against an old dress I hadn't worn in years. Deep burgundy. Fitted. I pulled it out, let the fabric drape over my arm. It still smelled faintly of something floral and powdery. A scent I couldn't name but recognized all the same. I didn't try it on. Just held it. Long enough to remember how I used to feel when I wore things like that. Before motherhood, before grief settled into the walls of this house. Before the quiet started to feel like punishment. There were photographs in a box under the bed. Wedding photos. Family trips. I sifted through them, my fingers trembling slightly. In one of them, I stood beside my husband, our faces turned to the camera with forced joy. His arm was around me, but his hand hovered just above my shoulder, not quite touching. Even then, even years ago, the gap was already there. The door creaked behind me. I startled, dropping the photo. I didn't mean to interrupt, his voice said gently. He was standing in the hallway, leaning lightly against the doorframe. His eyes fell to the photo at my feet. I bent to pick it up, brushing off imaginary dust. I was just looking. He nodded. I sometimes do that too. There was a pause, not awkward, just long enough to feel intentional. His eyes met mine. You look tired. I wasn't sure how to respond. I could have deflected. Laughed. But instead, I said, I am. Another silence. Then he stepped forward and placed something on the edge of the bed, an old photo album. Found this in the garage. Thought you might want to look through it. He turned to leave. And then paused. You know, she used to talk about you. A lot. Said you were the only one who ever really saw her. I didn't know what to say. The lump in my throat was sudden, unwelcome. He didn't wait for a response. Just walked away. I sat down slowly, the photo album on my lap. I opened the first page. There she was. Young, radiant, eyes full of life. In one photo, she was laughing with him, hand on his chest, head tilted back. That kind of laugh you couldn't fake. And in another. I was there. Younger. Smiling up at her. At both of them. A different life. I closed the album. My heart thudded heavily in my chest. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. My husband still hadn't returned. I could hear the low murmur of the television from downstairs, his father watching something old and familiar. I thought about going down. Just to sit. To share the silence. But I didn't. Instead, I turned on my side and pulled the blanket tighter. The dress was still draped over the chair in the corner. Watching me like a secret I wasn't ready to speak. And outside, the sky began to lighten again, pulling the day forward whether I was ready or not. The next morning, the house felt different. I couldn't explain it, but something in the air had shifted, subtle, like a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. I moved through the hallway slower than usual, as if afraid to disturb whatever fragile balance had settled in overnight. Downstairs, the soft clang of dishes and the faint aroma of brewed coffee reached me before I entered the kitchen. He was there already, my father-in-law, standing by the stove, stirring something in a pan. He looked over his shoulder and offered a quiet smile. It wasn't strange. He often took to the kitchen early. But something about the way he looked at me today lingered. I was wearing the burgundy dress. Not because I planned to, not because of him. It was just easy to put on. Comfortable. Familiar. At least that's what I told myself. He didn't say anything about it, but his eyes did. They paused, traveled the length of me, then quickly turned back to the pan. I poured myself a cup of coffee without a word and sat at the table, suddenly hyper-aware of how the fabric clung to my waist. He set a plate of eggs in front of me and sat down across the table. The chair creaked under his weight. We both ate in silence, the only sound the soft scraping of forks and the distant chirping of morning birds. After breakfast, I stepped outside into the garden. The morning sun was soft, not yet hot, and the earth smelled fresh from last night's rain. I knelt to pull out a stubborn weed, my fingers sinking into the damp soil. A shadow fell over me, and I looked up to see him standing behind me, holding a small shovel. "I thought I'd help," he said simply. We worked in silence. We always had. It was one of the things I found oddly comforting. No need to fill the air with words. Just the rhythm of movement, the quiet understanding of shared labor. His hands were rougher than I remembered. I watched as he pulled roots from the soil with a kind of patience that only grief could teach. At some point, I wiped a strand of hair from my forehead, leaving a streak of dirt across my cheek. He reached out slowly and brushed it away with his thumb. His touch was light, almost tentative, and lingered just a second too long. I didn't move. I couldn't. We stayed like that, frozen in some unspeakable moment, until the wind stirred and I stepped back. "I should get the hose," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He nodded, retreating to the opposite row of hedges. Later, as I stood by the sink rinsing off the garden dirt, I kept replaying that moment. Not the touch itself, but what it meant, or didn't. My hands trembled slightly as I dried them. I didn't understand what I felt. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was awareness. And in that awareness, something dangerous bloomed. By mid-afternoon, the house was quiet again. My husband still hadn't called. He rarely did when he was busy, which was always. I used to call him, leave messages, ask how his meetings were going. I'd stopped doing that months ago. I went upstairs to fold laundry, hoping routine would dull my thoughts. I was halfway through a stack of towels when I heard the soft knock. "Come in," I said, not looking up. He stepped into the room, a book in his hand. "I found this in the attic. Thought you might like it." I took it. A collection of poems. The cover faded, the pages yellowed. "Thank you," I said, setting it on the dresser. I didn't mean to stare, but my eyes lingered on his hands, the way they fidgeted, unsure of where to rest. "I should go," he said after a pause. But neither of us moved. "I miss her," he said finally. "Still. Every day." I nodded. "I know. And sometimes," he continued, his voice lower now, "I feel like I'm forgetting what it was like to be seen." The word hung there, thick between us. "I see you," I said before I could stop myself. He looked at me then, really looked. And in his eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Not hunger. Not desire. Just need. Simple, raw need. And then it happened. We didn't plan it. We didn't speak. There were no confessions, no explanations. He stepped forward. I didn't move. The space between us evaporated. Our faces were close enough to feel the warmth of each other's breath. We kissed. It was brief. Uncomplicated. Not romantic or heated. Just quiet and still. Like the acknowledgement of something that had already happened long before our lips met. When we pulled apart, neither of us said a word. He stepped back, his eyes wide, searching my face for something I couldn't give him. I turned away, focusing on the neatly folded towels, on the soft weight of routine that had always kept me grounded. He left the room. The door clicked softly behind him. I sat on the bed, the book of poems in my lap. My heart was racing, not from excitement but from fear. Not of what had happened, but of what hadn't. What it might lead to. What it might ruin. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay still, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening for sounds from down the hall. Footsteps. Doors. Anything. But the house remained silent. When my husband finally returned, it was well past midnight. He didn't wake me. Or maybe he thought I was asleep. He climbed into bed carefully, his side sinking slightly under his weight. The familiar scent of his cologne drifted toward me, clean, professional, distant. I wanted to roll over. To ask about his day. To confess something, anything, just to disrupt the stillness. But I didn't. I stayed frozen in place, pretending to breathe evenly, waiting for the rhythm of his breath to settle into sleep. It didn't. I think we both lay there, awake in the dark, two strangers on opposite sides of a shared life, wondering when we had stopped reaching for each other in the morning. The next morning began with sunlight cutting through the curtains in sharp lines, drawing attention to the fine dust in the air. I lay there longer than usual, eyes half open, listening. My husband's side of the bed was already empty, the dent in the pillow barely warm. I could hear the distant sound of running water, the shower, probably. A familiar routine, one I used to feel part of. Now I watched it from the sidelines. I got up slowly, wrapping a robe around me, and walked barefoot down the hallway. The floors creaked in the same places they always had. Familiar. Predictable. But something inside me felt newly unsettled. In the kitchen, I poured myself coffee and stared out the window, watching the sunlight stretch across the back garden. The hedges still carried drops of dew, and one of the flower pots had fallen over. The wind, probably. Or maybe the cat again. He entered the kitchen just as I was finishing my first sip. My father-in-law. He moved quietly, as he always did. His eyes met mine for the briefest moment, neutral, unreadable, and then he went to the cabinet for a glass. I didn't say anything. Neither did he. But it was there, hanging between us. Not guilt exactly, but recognition. We had crossed a line. Quietly, and without intent, but crossed it nonetheless. After a few moments, he asked if I needed help with anything in the garden today. I hesitated, then said I'd appreciate his help with the lower beds. The answer came too quickly, too easily. As if I wanted the excuse. Maybe I did. He nodded once and left the room. I stood there, holding my coffee cup, letting it grow cold in my hands. I could have said no. I could have created distance. I didn't. That was a choice too. Later that afternoon, with gloves on and sleeves rolled up, I worked beside him in the garden. The sun had grown stronger by then, and the air was thick with the scent of damp soil and trimmed rosemary. We worked mostly in silence. A few practical words, past the shears, that one needs to go, nothing more. At one point, as I stood to stretch my back, I caught him watching me. Not with hunger or lust, but with something quieter. Softer. Like he was trying to memorize the way the light hit my hair. I looked away, but the warmth that flushed through me lingered. When we finished, I brought out 2 glasses of water and sat with him on the small stone bench near the back fence. He thanked me, and we sat in a silence that no longer felt neutral. It felt deliberate. Delicate. "I'm sorry," he said after a long moment. I didn't ask what for. We both knew. I nodded, setting my glass down carefully. So am I. But neither of us said we regretted it. That night, my husband came home earlier than expected. He looked tired, his suit slightly rumpled, and his voice was hoarse when he greeted me. I asked if everything was all right. He said yes, just too many meetings. I cooked dinner. We ate. We talked about mundane things, a client, a delayed shipment, the neighbor's new fence. I laughed at the appropriate moments. He smiled. On the surface, everything was as it always had been. But I noticed the pause in his voice when he asked what I'd done that day. I answered evenly, listing garden work and laundry. He nodded slowly. No suspicion in his tone, just a hint of distance. Or maybe that was always there, and I was only now tuning into it. Later, in bed, he turned to me and rested his hand on my hip. I tensed, just slightly. He noticed. "You're quiet tonight," he said. "Just tired," I answered. He kissed my shoulder, then turned over and soon began to snore softly. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the breaths between us. 1, 2, 3. I remembered how it felt, hours earlier, sitting beside someone who looked at me like I mattered. Not as a function of a routine, not as part of the background, but fully. The next morning, a message from my sister lit up my phone. Just a short check-in. "How are things?" she asked. I stared at it for a while before typing back, "Fine." "Busy." A lie, but an easy one. I didn't mention the moments building up inside the walls of my house like steam behind a closed door. That afternoon, while folding clothes in the laundry room, the door creaked open behind me. He stepped in, holding a small basket of linens. He looked as if he'd thought twice about coming in but did it anyway. "I can help," he said. I handed him a towel. We folded side by side, careful not to brush hands. I could feel the tension tightening with each item stacked neatly on the shelf. Then came the knock on the front door. I walked out to find my friend from 2 streets over, the kind who appeared without warning, always cheerful, always probing. She hugged me, stepped inside without waiting for permission, and started chatting as if nothing in the world could ever be out of place. But as she poured herself tea and glanced around the room, her eyes narrowed just slightly. "You've got a different energy in here," she said, almost jokingly. I smiled too quickly. "Just spring cleaning." She nodded, though her expression said she didn't quite believe it. After she left, I returned to the laundry room. He was gone, but the scent of detergent and something fainter, aftershave, maybe, still hung in the air. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. I held the book of poems he'd given me. I hadn't opened it yet. The cover felt heavy in my hands. When I finally opened to a random page, my eyes landed on a single line, asterisk, "We never mean the moments that change everything." Asterisk. I closed the book and looked out at the street. The world went on as if nothing had shifted. Children rode bikes. A car passed by. Somewhere, someone was burning leaves. The ordinary persisted. But inside my chest, something else had taken root. Not love. Not passion. Just a slow unraveling of old beliefs, old habits, old silences. That night, I couldn't look my husband in the eyes as we got ready for bed. He didn't press. Maybe he didn't notice. Or maybe he noticed everything and chose not to see. We lay in the dark, inches apart, miles away. And I knew, even then, that a storm had started somewhere beneath the calm, quiet, persistent, and entirely of my own making. The day began with a gray sky that seemed reluctant to release the night. I woke to the familiar quiet of the house, though it no longer felt welcoming. The bed was cold beside me. My husband had left early for work as always, a note folded neatly on the pillow beside my side. I unfolded it without much hope. Busy day. Dinner late. Love. The word love felt heavier than usual, maybe because it felt so distant. Downstairs, my father-in-law was already awake. I caught the faint smell of coffee brewing before I entered the kitchen. He was sitting at the table, an old leather-bound book opened in front of him. His eyes lifted briefly when I came in, and for a moment, they seemed softer, searching. But he said nothing as I poured myself a cup and took a seat opposite him. The air between us was thick, layered with unspoken things. Neither of us wanted to disturb the fragile truce. I sipped my coffee slowly, trying to steady the flutter of emotions I wasn't ready to face. He closed the book and reached across the table, placing it near me. Found this in the attic, he said quietly. Thought it might interest you. I looked down and saw it was a collection of old photographs. The edges were frayed, the pages yellowed with age. I opened it, tracing the faces captured in grainy black and white. There was my husband as a boy, laughing with his mother, his late wife. And there, in one faded image, a young woman whose eyes held both strength and fragility. I swallowed hard and felt the weight of years pressing down. He watched me turn the pages, and I could feel his gaze resting on my hands. His fingers twitched as if he wanted to reach out, but stopped himself. I miss her, he said after a pause, voice breaking the stillness. Every day. I didn't respond immediately. The grief between us was a shared wound, though it belonged to him more directly. Still, I felt its edges cut into my own skin. Later that afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds, and I decided to tidy the garden. I found him already outside, kneeling by the flower beds, hands working the earth. We moved in silence, each tending to our task but always aware of the other's presence. The rhythm of digging, pulling weeds, and pruning bushes was meditative, almost soothing. It gave me a strange comfort, the earth beneath my fingers, the warm sun on my back. He paused beside me, holding a rose bush that needed trimming. You used to like roses, he said softly. I nodded. They remind me of her. He looked at me then, his eyes dark and full of something I couldn't name. You should keep them. Our hands brushed as he handed me the shears. A shock ran through me. I pulled back, chastising myself for the reaction. But the memory lingered. That evening, the house felt smaller. My husband returned late, exhaustion etched into his face. He asked little about my day, and I told him less. The space between us was filled with silence, heavy and impenetrable. After dinner, I retreated to the living room, flipping through the photo album again. The images felt like fragments of a life I barely understood. A life I hadn't lived. There was a knock at the door. I opened it to find my neighbor, a woman with keen eyes and a warm smile. She stepped inside without hesitation and immediately noticed the change in the atmosphere. You've been different lately, she said, pouring herself tea. I can't put my finger on it. I forced a smile and said nothing. How could I explain the shifting tides inside me? The strange connection that had begun to grow in the spaces where grief and loneliness intersected? As she left, I closed the door slowly, heart pounding. I was aware of the choices I was making, the lines I was crossing, even if I couldn't yet name them. That night, I lay awake, listening to the distant hum of the city beyond the walls. I thought about the man who had become both my father-in-law and something else entirely, a presence I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I tried. The boundaries between duty and desire blurred, and I felt myself standing on a precipice, unsure whether to step back or leap forward. The rain came unexpectedly that morning, soaking the patio and streaking the windows with silver lines that blurred the outside world. I stood by the kitchen sink, watching it fall, my fingers absently curled around a warm mug. The quiet patter filled the house, a rhythm softer than breath, but insistent. It matched something in me, something restless and waiting. My husband had left early again. He didn't even stir me when he dressed. I heard the soft click of the front door around 6, then silence. I stayed in bed for nearly an hour after that, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts tangled and tired. The rain softened the edges of the morning. I didn't feel like putting on makeup or fixing my hair. I wore an oversized sweater over a simple camisole and leggings, not caring much how I looked. I moved slowly, as if any sharp movement might tip something over inside me that I wasn't ready to confront. He was already in the living room when I walked in, my father-in-law, seated in the old armchair with a newspaper folded across his knee. He looked up when he heard me but said nothing. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of calm and caution. I nodded, poured him a coffee, and handed it to him wordlessly. He took it, his fingers brushing mine for just a second. The contact was brief, but deliberate. I didn't pull away. Neither did he. The electricity flickered around noon, and then the lights went out completely. I sighed and checked my phone, no signal. The wind had picked up, and the storm was clearly worsening. "Looks like it's just us and candlelight," I said, my voice quiet but steady. He smiled faintly. "Reminds me of the blackouts we used to have. You learn to appreciate the quiet." The quiet wasn't what unsettled me. It was the closeness. The way we moved around each other without touching, but always aware. It had been days since our kiss, and we hadn't spoken of it. We hadn't dared. But the memory of it lived between us, a silent thread tying each shared glance, each near contact into something more. As the rain intensified, I lit candles throughout the downstairs. The living room glowed amber. The air smelled faintly of wax and damp wool. I made tea and joined him on the couch this time. We sat at opposite ends, but the space didn't feel safe anymore, it felt charged. He reached for the photo album again. We'd left it open on the table from earlier in the week. He passed it to me, open to a photo I hadn't noticed before, one from years ago, of him and his wife sitting in the very same room. They were laughing, her hand on his chest, his head tilted back in laughter. "She hated storms," he said, not looking at me. "They made her feel vulnerable. Like the world could fall apart at any moment." I turned the page slowly. The next picture was of their wedding day, black and white, a soft blur around the edges. He looked younger, but the eyes were the same. Thoughtful. Protective. I closed the book. "She was beautiful," I said. He nodded. She was. A long silence settled between us. The kind that didn't beg to be filled. And yet, I could feel words pressing against my teeth. "You've been kind to me," I said. Even when I didn't know I needed kindness. He looked at me then, his expression unreadable. "You've held this family together more than you know." It was a compliment, but it hit deeper than that. Because I didn't feel held together. I felt like I was unraveling, quietly, invisibly, with every moment I spent in that house, pretending to be whole. The candle flickered between us, casting shadows across his face. He leaned slightly forward, his hand resting loosely on his knee. His eyes didn't leave mine. "We're not doing anything wrong," he said, though his voice betrayed his doubt. "I know," I replied, though I wasn't sure I believed it. He reached out slowly, as if testing gravity, and tucked a strand of damp hair behind my ear. His hand hovered there, then dropped. We kissed. It was quiet. No dramatic movement, no hesitation. Just a simple, shared acknowledgement that something had shifted, again. When we pulled away, he didn't apologize. Neither did I. A few minutes later, we moved back to our sides of the couch. The space between us now felt like an ocean. Not of guilt, but of consequence. I left the room not long after, retreating to the bathroom under the excuse of checking on the candles. But inside, I leaned against the closed door, breathing slowly, trying to calm the pulse pounding behind my ribs. What were we doing? What had I just done? When the power came back later that night, the house returned to its usual rhythms. The refrigerator hummed. The lights blinked on, revealing a house that looked unchanged, but everything had changed. My husband returned shortly after dark, soaked through and irritated. He kissed my cheek absent-mindedly and complained about traffic. I smiled where I was supposed to and handed him a towel. He didn't notice the silence in my voice. Or the way I stood with my arms folded, as if shielding myself from something invisible. We ate dinner while the rain died down outside. He scrolled through emails at the table. I washed dishes without looking up. My father-in-law didn't join us. He stayed in his room. Later, when we climbed into bed, my husband pulled me close. His hand moved to my hip, familiar and practiced, but there was no spark in it. I let him hold me because I didn't know what else to do. I lay with my eyes open long after he'd fallen asleep. In the dark, I remembered the way the candlelight had danced on the wall, the way his hand had hovered near mine, the weight of that kiss. And for the first time, I couldn't decide whether I felt ashamed or seen. The storm had passed. But inside me, something far more dangerous had begun. The next morning arrived with that peculiar hush that follows a storm. The streets outside glistened, still damp from the rain, and the sky was a blank canvas of soft gray. I sat at the kitchen table, unmoving, my fingers curled around a mug I hadn't sipped from in minutes. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that knows too much, that listens too hard. My husband had already left for work. He hadn't said much the night before. A few practical remarks, a tired smile, a kiss on the forehead that landed without conviction. He hadn't noticed the way I stiffened under his touch, or maybe he had and chose to ignore it. We both did that, lately, pretended we didn't notice things. I heard the creak of footsteps from upstairs. They were measured and slow. A familiar rhythm I had grown used to since the day he moved in. My father-in-law appeared a moment later, pausing in the doorway like he wasn't sure if he should enter. He was dressed plainly in jeans, a sweater that looked older than I remembered, and his face was unreadable. We didn't speak. He poured himself coffee and sat across from me. His eyes moved to the window, to the sky, anywhere but my face. I found myself doing the same. The silence between us had evolved into something unmanageable. The kind that no longer comforted. I pushed my chair back and stood without a word, carrying my half-full mug to the sink. I didn't know what I was doing, leaving, staying, hoping he'd say something. He didn't. In the afternoon, the house filled with small, mundane sounds, the hum of the washing machine, the clinking of dishes, the occasional groan of wood as the structure adjusted to the cooling air. But inside, I was anything but settled. I opened a drawer in the living room, looking for batteries for the remote, and instead found an envelope. I didn't recognize the handwriting at first. It was delicate, old-fashioned. When I opened it, a photograph slid out, a candid shot taken in the garden from a week ago. Me, laughing. And behind me, his hand lightly brushing my back. A fleeting, almost imperceptible gesture. But it was there. I froze. The photo had clearly been taken through the window. From inside the house. Probably by accident. Perhaps my husband's colleague had snapped it during a visit, testing his lens. Or maybe not. Maybe it was just coincidence. But I felt something change in that moment. I studied the image for long minutes, tracing the shape of my own shoulders, the tilt of his head, the subtle proximity. I should have felt guilt. But what I felt was fear, not of being found out, but of what that closeness revealed. It wasn't a moment of seduction. It was tenderness. Familiarity. Something that had no place in this house, but had taken root anyway. That evening, I left the photo in the drawer and closed it slowly. My husband came home late. He was distracted, as usual, and spoke in short, clipped sentences. I asked how his day went, more out of habit than interest. He responded with numbers and complaints. I nodded along, pretending to listen, though my mind was still in the garden, with that captured second. Later, as I tidied up the dining table, he scrolled through his phone absent-mindedly. I noticed his thumb hover over the gallery app for a second too long. Then he set the phone down, face down. He looked up at me. "You've been quiet." I swallowed. Just tired. He nodded, but something passed over his face, brief, almost invisible. A crack in his mask, quickly sealed. He didn't ask anything more. In bed, I lay beside him without touching. The warmth from his body did not reach me. I stared at the ceiling, retracing my own steps. I hadn't lied to him. Not in words. But in silences, in omissions, in things left unsaid, I had become fluent. The next day, my father-in-law suggested we take a drive into town. I hesitated. The idea of being alone with him, outside the safety of the house, felt dangerous. But I said yes anyway. We didn't talk much during the drive. The roads were still slick, the trees dripping from the storm. When we arrived at the hardware store, he picked up a few small things for the house. Nails. Light bulbs. A new handle for the shed door. I walked behind him slowly, unsure whether I was hiding or following. On the way back, he pulled the car over near the lake. There was no one else around. The sky had begun to clear, but the wind was sharp, pushing ripples across the water. I shouldn't have kissed you, he said, his hands resting on the steering wheel. I looked straight ahead. You weren't the only one who did. He nodded, almost to himself. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I exhaled, shaky. I don't know what it's supposed to be. We sat in the silence of the car, the engine idling, the heater blowing softly. I felt the weight of my wedding ring pressing into my finger like a question I couldn't answer. I never planned any of this, I said, almost to the window. He replied, neither did I. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't demand anything. Because there was nothing to demand. No promises, no future, no plan. Just the truth that something had happened. And it wouldn't unhappen. When we got home, the house looked the same, but I knew we'd left something behind at that lake, or maybe brought something new with us. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself water, and stood still. And then I heard it. A sound I didn't expect. My husband's voice from the living room, calling my name. He was home early. Unexpectedly. And I had just walked back into a house filled with the scent of someone else's aftershave. The sound of his voice from the living room struck me like a cold wave, pulling me out of the stillness I'd been floating in since the drive. My body stiffened instinctively. I hadn't expected my husband home until late evening. That had been the plan. The plan had given me space. And now, all at once, the plan collapsed. I turned toward the hallway, running through possibilities in my head. Had he seen us driving back? Did he notice how closely we walked from the car to the door? Did he pick up on the scent I had tried to mask with perfume but could still feel clinging to my skin? His voice came again, more casual this time. I brought food. I walked into the living room slowly, every step deliberate, as if trying not to disturb something fragile. He stood near the coffee table, a takeout bag in his hands and his jacket still on. He looked tired, slightly damp from the mist outside, but otherwise normal. That almost made it worse, the normalcy. I thought you had meetings, I said, keeping my voice even. He gave a small shrug. They got cancelled. I figured I'd surprise you. I smiled, thinly. You did. He leaned in to kiss me, and I turned just slightly at the last second. Not obviously. Not enough to raise suspicion. Just enough to make it land on my cheek instead of my lips. He didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did and filed it away for later. We sat down on the couch, and he unpacked the food, 2 containers, some rice, steamed vegetables, soy-glazed chicken. My appetite was gone, but I made a show of eating. Every bite felt heavy, like I was swallowing pebbles. He talked about traffic, the weather, something trivial one of his coworkers said in a group chat. I nodded at the right moments, smiled once or twice, but most of me wasn't there. Part of me was still in the car, parked beside the lake, with the weight of his father's voice still echoing in my head. Asterisk, it wasn't supposed to be like this. Asterisk. We finished eating, and he gathered the containers into a neat pile, stood, and headed to the kitchen. As he disappeared behind the corner, I glanced toward the hallway. The door to his father's room was closed. He hadn't come out since we returned. I felt a pang of anxiety rise in my throat. What if he came down now? What if they spoke? What if something unspoken passed between them and lit a fuse? When my husband returned, he held his phone loosely and gestured toward me. I want to show you something. He sat beside me again, pulling up the gallery. My stomach tightened. He scrolled through a few photos, some from work, a shot of the street during the rain, then a picture I immediately recognized. Me in the garden. Laughing. And just behind me, barely visible through the glare, a figure. His father. I forgot I had this, he said. One of the guys from the office was testing his new camera when he visited. Sent it to me a week ago. I said nothing, afraid of what was coming next. He tilted the phone toward me. It's a nice shot, don't you think? I nodded. Yeah. I like it. He watched me for a moment. It's different. You don't laugh like that often anymore. The comment was soft, not accusatory. But it landed heavily. I guess I just don't have as many reasons to, I said before I could stop myself. He blinked slowly, absorbing my words. Is that how you feel? I looked down at my hands. I don't know. He didn't respond right away. He stood, a phone still in hand, and walked over to the window. The streetlights outside were starting to flicker on. Their glow cast long shadows through the room. I've been wondering, he said, not turning around, if maybe we've started living next to each other instead of with each other. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth in his words struck too close to the hollow inside me. He sighed, finally turning back. I don't want to lose you. Something in my chest cracked at that. A deep, aching guilt welled up, but it came tangled with resentment, for how long I'd felt invisible, how many mornings I'd spent alone at the breakfast table, how long I'd gone without hearing my name spoken like it mattered. I stood. I need to take a shower. He nodded. Okay. I climbed the stairs slowly, the air thick and warm around me. When I reached the landing, I hesitated. His father's door was still shut. I didn't knock. I didn't stop. I went straight to the bathroom, locked the door, turned on the water, and stood beneath it fully clothed until my skin prickled. I stayed there for a long time. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My husband lay beside me, breathing slow and steady, already gone to whatever version of peace his dreams allowed. I stared at the ceiling, counting the faint cracks in the plaster, following their lines like maps. They branched and bent and curled, intersecting here and there, but never forming a complete shape. Just like us. At some point, I turned on my side, staring at the soft blue glow of his charger light across the room. I felt hollowed out, suspended between two people, two lives, two versions of myself I didn't recognize. And when I finally did fall asleep, I dreamed I was standing at the lake alone, the sky darkening above me, the water silent and still. I was holding the photograph in my hands, but the image had faded, just gray paper now, blank and unreadable. In the dream, I dropped it into the water and watched the ripples carry it away. When I woke, my pillow was damp. And I didn't know whether from sweat, or tears, or both. The next morning began quietly. The kind of quiet that didn't soothe. It pressed in from all sides, the air in the house too still, like everything and everyone inside was holding their breath. I sat at the kitchen table, barely touching my breakfast, the toast cooling untouched beside my coffee. The smell of it made me vaguely nauseous. Or maybe it wasn't the toast. I heard his voice from upstairs, my husband's, asking about a missing tie. I answered without looking up, telling him it was probably still in the laundry. A few minutes later, the sound of drawers opening and closing followed, then footsteps on the stairs, then the front door. He didn't say goodbye. I didn't ask for one. After he left, I stood for a long time at the sink, hands resting on the cold porcelain, watching the neighborhood through the window. The morning was gray again, the clouds stretched low and unbroken. A neighbor walked her dog slowly down the opposite sidewalk, pausing near our mailbox. I wondered, not for the first time, what she thought of our household, the husband always away, the father-in-law who never moved out, the wife who never smiled much anymore. When I finally turned from the window, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass. My face looked pale and older somehow, but not tired. Just distant. Like I was watching my life from the outside. I hadn't intended to lose myself this way. It had happened gradually, like a slow fade, one morning, one silence, one missing glance at a time. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning. Not out of necessity, but because movement made the stillness inside feel manageable. I wiped down surfaces that were already spotless. Rearranged books that hadn't been touched in months. Swept corners that didn't need it. Anything to avoid thinking. Around midday, I heard the soft knock on the doorframe. I turned and saw him, my father-in-law, standing in the hallway, holding a small cardboard box. "I found this in the garage," he said. "Didn't want to throw it out without checking." I nodded, stepping aside as he entered the room. He set the box on the dining table and opened the lid. Inside were old family photos, school awards, postcards, scraps of life that had once been meaningful and were now just relics. I reached in and pulled out a photo of my husband at 16, awkward and lanky, grinning in a soccer uniform. I smiled faintly and set it aside. We sorted in silence for a while. Occasionally, our hands brushed over the same envelope or corner of a photo, and every time it happened, I felt the same pulse of heat rise beneath my skin. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't lust. It was something quieter. Something heavier. At one point, he lifted a yellowed envelope and handed it to me. "From your first Christmas here, I think." I took it, opening the flap slowly. Inside was a folded letter, my handwriting, younger and more optimistic. I read it silently, a thank you note I had written to his wife for a sweater she'd made me. The words were cheerful, warm, grateful. They felt like they belonged to someone else. "She loved you," he said quietly, not looking up. "I loved her too." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with mutual understanding, not of what was, but of what had been lost. After we finished sorting, he stood and took the empty box back toward the garage. I stayed at the table, tracing the edges of the photographs we'd kept, feeling the weight of their stillness. They captured a life that no longer existed, people frozen in moments of closeness that now felt unreachable. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside to the back garden. The sky remained heavy, but the wind was still. I moved to the bench near the roses, the ones he'd pruned earlier in the week, and sat, wrapping my cardigan tighter around me. The air smelled like damp soil and something older, deeper, I couldn't name. He joined me a few minutes later without a word. He didn't sit beside me, not at first, just stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the horizon. Then, after a long pause, he lowered himself to the other side of the bench, leaving a careful space between us. "We can't keep pretending," he said eventually. I looked down at my hands. "I don't think I've been pretending." He turned slightly, just enough to catch my expression. "I know. That's what makes it worse." Neither of us spoke for a while. The garden was still. A leaf drifted from a branch, landing on the stone path at our feet. We both watched it fall. "I didn't plan this," I said quietly. "I wasn't looking for anything." "I believe you." But something changed. I felt it too. We sat there, side by side, and I realized how familiar this had become, these conversations without conclusions, these pauses filled with meanings we didn't dare name. We were not lovers. Not a couple. We had no name for what we were, and that made it harder to resist. Easier to hide behind. "I think he suspects," I said suddenly. His jaw tightened, just slightly. "Because of the photo?" I nodded. He didn't ask what I planned to do. He knew I didn't know. That evening, the house was quiet again. My husband didn't come home for dinner. A text had arrived late afternoon, asterisk stuck at the office. "Don't wait up, asterisk." I deleted it without replying. I stood in the kitchen long after the sun went down, hands resting on the counter, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Then I walked to the cabinet, pulled down 2 glasses, and filled them both with water. Out of habit. I stared at the second glass for a long time before pouring it back into the sink. Upstairs, the door to his room was closed. I paused at the base of the stairs, one hand on the railing. Then I turned and walked down the hallway instead, into the guest room, where I hadn't stepped in weeks. The room was untouched, neat, empty. I sat on the edge of the bed and folded my hands in my lap. And then, without thinking, I reached for my phone. The screen glowed in the dark. My fingers hovered over the messaging app. I didn't type anything. I just watched the blinking cursor in the empty message box. Then I turned off the screen, lay back on the bed, and closed my eyes. And when I opened them again, it was already morning. The morning light bled slowly into the room, filtered through thin curtains that didn't quite block out the gray sky beyond. I lay still, listening to the quiet hum of the house waking up around me. It took me a moment to remember where I was. The guest room. The unfamiliar shape of the headboard. The way the mattress dipped differently beneath me. And then I remembered the silence I had chosen the night before, and how easy it had been to surrender to it. I rose quietly, smoothing the blanket with a gesture that felt almost ceremonial. The hallway outside was empty, and the air felt cooler than usual. I moved through the house on instinct, turning on lights, folding back the blinds, boiling water for tea, everything done mechanically, without purpose. There was something settling about movement. It gave the illusion of control. He entered the kitchen shortly after. My father-in-law. He looked surprised to see me up so early. We locked eyes for a moment, and something unspoken passed between us, not tension exactly, but recognition. We had both reached the edge of something and hadn't decided whether to step back or forward. He nodded a soft greeting and poured himself a cup of coffee. I busied myself with buttering toast I didn't plan to eat. "Your husband left early," he said after a while, his voice low, cautious. I nodded. "He's been leaving early a lot lately." He didn't comment on that, and I didn't press. We sat in silence, facing opposite ends of the table, the clink of utensils and sip of mugs our only conversation. It felt like we had reached a threshold where words no longer offered guidance. The doorbell rang just before 10. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, it was my husband's sister, unexpected, but not entirely out of character. She held a plastic bag in one hand and a paper coffee cup in the other. "I was in the neighborhood," she said brightly. "Thought I'd stop by." Her visits were always a performance. She had the same polite smile, the same quick eyes that never stopped reading the room. She hugged me lightly and stepped inside, setting the bag on the counter. It was full of groceries. Things I hadn't asked for. I figured you might be running low, she said as she unpacked. And I haven't seen you in weeks. She glanced around, her gaze drifting toward the hallway, toward the quiet of the rest of the house. Where is everyone? Out, I said. Or busy. She offered a tight smile, the kind people wear when they suspect something but don't have proof. You look tired. I didn't respond. I just handed her a glass of water and tried to ignore the way her eyes flicked toward the back door, toward the garden, toward all the invisible corners of the life I was trying to hold together. She didn't stay long. She never did. Just long enough to see, to collect pieces, to hint. When she left, I stood at the sink again, watching the sidewalk where she disappeared around the corner. I felt exposed. Not because she had said anything, but because she hadn't. Because I could feel what was building, slow, steady, inevitable. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I folded laundry. I sorted through mail. I watched the second hand of the kitchen clock circle again and again. Time had never moved so slowly and still managed to escape me. Later, I went upstairs and found the drawer where I kept our wedding photos. They were tucked away neatly, stacked between letters, old cards, a pressed flower from years ago I could no longer identify. I pulled out one photo, on the front steps of the church, beaming. My hand was tucked into his, my smile so wide it nearly split my face. I remembered how heavy the dress had been. How long we stood in that exact pose for the photographer. How my cheeks hurt from smiling. Not because I wasn't happy, I was, but because it had all felt like something I had to earn. Even then, I had wanted to prove I deserved it. I placed the photo back and closed the drawer. That evening, my husband returned with groceries I hadn't asked for, the second offering in one day. He set the bags on the counter and kissed my cheek distractedly. His phone buzzed once, then again. He ignored it, opening the fridge instead. You didn't answer my text earlier, he said casually, not turning around. I didn't hear it, I lied. He nodded. Long day? They all feel the same now. He paused, and for a second, I thought he might say something real. Something difficult. But then he just asked what I wanted for dinner. I told him I wasn't hungry. He made himself a sandwich. After he went upstairs, I sat in the living room alone. The silence stretched again. I reached for the book I'd left on the end table days ago but didn't open it. Instead, I looked toward the hallway, toward the door that led to the room where all of this had begun. And for the first time, I didn't want to go to it. I wanted to leave. The thought came so clearly it startled me. I pictured myself stepping out the door, walking until the houses blurred into something unfamiliar. I pictured renting a room somewhere far, somewhere by water. I pictured writing a letter, not to confess, not to explain, but to say, simply, I had to. But I didn't move. I sat there, wrapped in the stillness of the evening, while the house hummed around me, unaware of how close it was to coming undone. And upstairs, in separate rooms, they both slept. One by blood, the other by vow. And I, somewhere in between, no longer belonged to either. The last morning felt different, though nothing visible had changed. The same light filtered through the curtains, soft and diffused. The same sounds echoed in the hallways, the kettle's low whistle, footsteps overhead, the hum of a distant lawnmower outside. But the weight in the air was heavier, as if the house itself sensed the balance had shifted. I woke before anyone else. The decision had been made quietly, sometime in the early hours as I lay awake, watching the pale blue cast of dawn on the ceiling. It hadn't been a grand decision, not a moment of rebellion or defiance. Just a quiet acknowledgement of what I already knew, I couldn't stay. I moved through the room silently, collecting a few things, a change of clothes, my phone charger, a small leather-bound notebook where I'd written scattered thoughts over the years. I stood for a long time by the dresser, my hand hovering over my wedding ring. I slipped it off, letting it rest in the bowl beside my earrings, its circle bright and cold. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty. I boiled water, made tea, stood at the window as the world outside woke up. A few sparrows hopped along the fence, the mailman delivered letters to the blue box across the street. All of it ordinary. None of it mine. He entered the kitchen, my husband, hair still damp from the shower, tie in hand. He paused when he saw me. His eyes flicked to the bag at my feet, then to my face. He didn't ask questions, not directly. Maybe he already understood. "You're leaving?" he said, voice rough from sleep. I nodded. "For a while. I don't know. Space, I guess." He leaned against the counter, running a hand through his hair. "Is there someone else?" It was the question I had dreaded, though not for the reason he might think. I shook my head, but not quickly enough. He looked away, jaw tight. "I thought I was doing everything right. I gave you the house. I worked. I tried to provide." "I know," I said softly. "You did. This isn't about that." He let out a breath, his shoulders sinking. "Is it about him?" I hesitated, then said the only thing that felt true. "It's about me. I lost myself somewhere in all this. I need to try and find her again." He didn't answer. The silence between us was full of all the things we'd never said, all the hurts we'd collected quietly over the years. He finally nodded, pushing off the counter, and left the kitchen. The sound of his footsteps faded up the stairs. I poured my tea into a travel mug, put on my shoes by the door, and stepped outside. The air was cool and sharp, filled with the scent of cut grass and rain-soaked earth. I walked slowly down the driveway, feeling the familiar crunch of gravel beneath my feet, not looking back. At the corner, I paused, pulling my cardigan tighter. I looked up at the sky, gray and endless, and felt both emptier and lighter than I had in years. Later, in a small rented room overlooking a park, I unpacked the few things I'd brought. I sat at the little desk by the window and opened my notebook. I wrote without thinking, letting the words spill out, not confessions, not explanations, just fragments of memory, hope, fear. I wrote until the sun was high in the sky and the page was full. I didn't hear from him that day. I didn't expect to. There was nothing left to say. That evening, as dusk softened the world outside, my phone buzzed with a single message. Not from my husband. Not from my father-in-law. From myself, scheduled months ago in some fit of hope. It read simply, "You are allowed to begin again." I smiled, tucking my legs beneath me on the bed. I let the silence settle, not as punishment but as possibility. I let myself feel the ache, the grief, the relief, all braided together. I watched the lights come on in the park below, people walking dogs, children shouting in the last light of day. Life went on, not the life I had built, but a new one, uncertain and unpromised. I didn't know where I would go from here. I didn't know what I would find. But I knew I couldn't go back. And for the first time in years, I let myself believe that was enough.